The flour was already on his hands before he realized what she had done to him. Eli Cutter stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, hat still in hand from the morning ride, and he could not move. Not because the scene before him was violent or strange, or even particularly remarkable to any other man alive, but because Lena Johansson was standing at his stove in the pale gray light of 6 in the morning, humming something soft and Swedish under her breath, and the smell of biscuits browning in the iron skillet had filled every cold corner of the house he had spent 4 years making deliberately, intentionally, relentlessly empty. His throat closed. He had not felt anything close to this since the morning they buried Clara. He had made certain of that. He had built walls with the efficiency of a man who understood construction, who had watched enough things fall apart to know exactly how to keep them standing. He had been the Marshal of Canyon Creek, Colorado, for 3 years, and in those 3 years not one person in that town, not his deputy, not the minister, not the widow Hargrove who brought pie every Easter, had seen him do anything that could be interpreted as soft. He had cultivated coldness the way a farmer cultivates a field, with patience, with repetition, with the knowledge that the yield was survival. And now there was flour on his kitchen table. There was a woman humming in his house. And Eli Cutter, the man every drunk in 3 counties described as the one who would put a bullet through your knee before you finished your threat, felt something crack open in his chest like ice on a river in March. He took 1 step back, then another. Then her voice came, steady as anything, without her even turning around. "There is coffee on the shelf," she said. "I found the pot." He did not answer. She turned then, and she looked at him with those eyes that were neither blue nor gray but some stubborn color in between, and she tilted her head the way she did when she was deciding something. "You look like you have seen a ghost, Marshal." He had. He had seen every ghost he owned, all at once, standing in the kitchen that Clara used to fill with the same smell, the same warmth, the same impossible softness. "You should not be in this kitchen," he said, and his voice came out wrong, not cold, just raw. Lena Johansson set down her wooden spoon, and she looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who had survived enough hard winters to know that some things needed time before they were ready. "I know," she said quietly. "I know I should not be. But I am here now, and the biscuits are nearly done, and I think you have not eaten a proper meal in longer than you would admit. This is where the story truly begins. Not in that kitchen doorway. Not in that moment when the Marshal of Canyon Creek stood with a cracked, open heart, and the smell of biscuits unraveling 4 years of careful armor. It begins 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in late October of 1879, when the southbound stage from Denver rolled into Canyon Creek carrying 17 pieces of luggage, 1 extremely irritated station agent's letter of complaint, and 1 Lena Johansson. She was 26 years old. She was 5 feet and 4 inches of Scandinavian stubbornness, wrapped in a brown wool traveling dress that had seen better days and better country. She had come from Minneapolis by way of Denver, and before Minneapolis, she had come from a small town in Sweden whose name most Americans could not pronounce. And she had come to Canyon Creek specifically because the advertisement in the Minneapolis Scandinavian Tribune had promised schoolteacher opportunities in the Colorado territories for women of good character and practical temperament. Lena had both in abundance. She had also come with a secret, though she would not have called it that. She would have called it a complication, which was the word her mother had used when anything in life turned difficult and inconvenient and refused to resolve itself neatly. The complication was this: her last employer, a certain Mr. Aldous Brennan of Minneapolis, had accused her of theft when she had refused to continue providing what he called personal instruction in the privacy of his study after 9 in the evening. The accusation was false. The damage to her reputation was not insignificant, and so she had packed her 17 pieces of luggage, which contained mostly books and exactly one good dress, and she had bought a ticket as far west as her savings would carry her. Canyon Creek, Colorado, population 841. The town was perched at the edge of the wet mountains, south of Pueblo, with a main street that ran straight and flat and was perpetually dusty, except in the spring when it was perpetually muddy. There was a general store, a livery stable, a church that held services every Sunday and extra prayer meetings whenever the Tanner gang was reported nearby, a saloon called the Golden Spur that was loud on Friday nights, and a marshal's office that was quiet every single day regardless of what was happening because Marshal Eli Cutter did not invite noise. Lena stepped off the stage and immediately tripped over a loose board on the station platform. She did not fall, because she caught herself on the railing with the reflexes of a woman who had been managing her own survival for years. But she did make a noise that attracted the attention of several bystanders, including a small boy who laughed, the station agent who looked alarmed, and one man who was leaning against the post office wall across the street with his arms folded and his hat pulled low. The marshal of Canyon Creek looked at the arriving woman once, registered that she was upright and unharmed, and looked away. He would think about that moment later. How he had looked and then looked away. How he had made the choice in that first second not to look again. Lena Johansson squared her shoulders, addressed the station agent with a request for directions to the schoolhouse, and did not look at the man leaning against the post office wall, because she had learned some things about men who stood that way, arms folded, watching and not helping. The schoolhouse position had indeed been advertised, but it was occupied. The woman who had held it, a Mrs. Patricia Finch, had not retired or relocated as the advertisement implied. She had died of a fever in August, and the school board, comprised of 4 local men who met irregularly and argued constantly, had placed the advertisement without entirely agreeing on the terms of what they were advertising. Lena discovered all of this within her first hour in town, sitting in the general store owned by a kind man named Harold Stokes, who gave her information in the same spirit that he gave out penny candy, freely, and with the understanding that everyone needed some. "The board is going to meet Friday," Harold Stokes told her, setting a cup of coffee on his counter without being asked. "I would not worry too much. They need someone badly. The children have been running loose since August and their mothers are at the end of their ropes." "I have credentials," Lena said. She had a folder with letters of reference from 2 ministers in Minneapolis, a professor at the University of Minnesota who had supervised her teacher training, and a family she had worked for who had declined to be dragged into the Brennan business and had written her a reference so warm it practically glowed. "That will help," Harold Stokes said, "though around here, being willing to show up is generally the biggest credential." She did not have anywhere to stay while she waited for Friday's meeting. The town had no hotel, only a boarding house run by a woman named Delphine Marsh, and when Lena presented herself at Delphine Marsh's door with her 17 pieces of luggage, she was informed that the boarding house was currently full, that a family of 4 from Kansas had taken the last room the previous week, and that Delphine was very sorry, but there was simply no space. Lena stood on the street with 17 pieces of luggage and considered her options. She had $14.30. She had credentials. She had practical temperament. She was going to need more than all of that. It was Harold Stokes who suggested it, and he suggested it with the particular discomfort of a man who knew it was a reasonable idea but could also predict how it would be received. "There is one place," he said, watching her face carefully, "that has a spare room. Has had one for years. Nobody uses it. The man who lives there would not generally be what you would call hospitable, but he is not dangerous and he is not dishonest, which is more than you can say for a great deal of housing options in a frontier town." Lena raised her eyebrows. "Who?" Harold Stokes cleared his throat. "The Marshal." The Marshal's house stood at the north end of Main Street, set back from the road behind a low fence that had been built solidly and maintained well. It was a two-story frame house, painted white at some point in the past, now faded to the color of old teeth. The yard was clean. The windows were clean. Everything about the place suggested a man who maintained things at the basic level required to keep them from falling apart, and not 1 inch further. Lena knocked on the door. There was a long pause. Then the door opened, and she came face to face for the first time with Eli Cutter. He was 34 years old. He was 6 feet and 1 inch tall, with the lean, weathered build of a man who spent most of his life outdoors and ate when he remembered to. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes the color of gunmetal, which was not a metaphor but a genuinely accurate color description. A flat, unreflective gray-brown that gave away nothing. He had a Marshal star on his vest, and a Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip, and the expression of a man who had opened his door expecting either a complaint or trouble, and was not entirely sure that what he was looking at was not both. "Marshal Cutter," Lena said, because Harold Stokes had given her the name. "My name is Lena Johansson. I am the new schoolteacher. I have nowhere to sleep. I was told you have a spare room." A pause. "Harold Stokes told you that," Eli Cutter said. "He did." Another pause. Something moved behind those gunmetal eyes, something that might have been calculation, or might have been the early stages of reluctant recognition that this situation was going to go a certain way regardless of what he said next. "The room is not prepared," he said. "I can prepare it," Lena said. "There are rules." "I expect there are." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She had survived a Minneapolis winter, an Atlantic crossing, and Aldous Brennan. She was not going to be undone by a pair of gray-brown eyes and a man who was clearly hoping she would simply go away. $5 a month, he said. "You do not touch anything in this house without asking. You are not here when I am working, which means you are not in the main rooms in the evenings. You are responsible for your own meals." "Agreed," Lena said and held out her hand. He looked at it. Then he shook it once briefly, with the air of a man signing his name to a document he had not entirely read. She moved in that afternoon. The spare room was on the upper floor, across the hall from what she understood was his room, and it was exactly as he had described, unprepared. There was a bed frame with no mattress, a window with no curtain, and a layer of dust on everything that suggested it had not been opened in a very long time. There was a single nail on the wall where a picture had once hung. She could see the ghost of the frame in the slightly less faded paint around it. She did not ask about it. She went back to Harold Stokes's store and purchased a mattress tick and enough hay to fill it, a length of calico for a curtain, and a small wash basin and pitcher. She carried everything up herself in 3 trips because the Marshal was not home, and when she was done, she sat on her bed in the October afternoon light and felt something she had not felt in several months, which was cautious optimism. The school board met on Friday. Lena attended with her folder of credentials, her practical temperament, and the endorsement of Harold Stokes, who came along with the specific intention of being helpful and achieved it. She was hired on a probationary basis for a 3-month term with a salary of $30 a month, which was modest but sufficient, and she was to begin on the following Monday. She had been in Canyon Creek for 5 days. She had a room. She had a job. She had a landlord who moved through the house like a weather system, present, noticeable, impossible to ignore, and entirely unconcerned with her existence. This last point should have been convenient. It was, in fact, the opposite. The problem with Eli Cutter was not that he was cold. Lena had known cold people. Her father had been cold in the specific way of Scandinavian men who grew up in hard places and expressed love through practical action rather than words. The problem with Eli Cutter was that he was cold in a way that felt chosen, maintained. Like watching a man hold very still in the dark, because he had learned that moving was more dangerous. She noticed it in small ways first. He ate alone, standing at the kitchen counter, and he ate the same thing every morning, hardtack and coffee, which was the food of a man who had stopped caring enough to cook. He kept the house exactly clean enough and no more. He had books on a shelf in the front room. She noticed them, 5 books, carefully kept, and they were worn in the way that meant they had been read many times, but she never saw him reading them. There was a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. A woman. Young, dark-haired, serious-faced in the way of photographs, which required you to sit still long enough that seriousness was the natural result. Behind the woman in the photograph, just barely visible, was the corner of what appeared to be this very kitchen. Lena did not ask about the photograph. She focused on her school, on her students, who were 14 in number, ranging in age from 6 to 15, and who needed everything from basic reading to long division, and were collectively the most chaotic gathering of small people she had encountered. She loved them immediately and without reservation, which was a particular quality of hers, the ability to love people quickly and without apology. She kept to her side of the invisible line in the Marshal's house. She ate in her room or came down when he was clearly out. She was polite at the rare moments they crossed paths, which he met with brief courtesy and nothing more. The first real conversation happened 3 weeks after her arrival, on a cold November evening when the temperature had dropped sharply, and the wind was coming down off the mountains in a way that made the house creak. She had come downstairs to get water and found him sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp burning, reading a report of some kind. He did not look up when she came in, but his posture shifted fractionally, the way a person shifts when they are aware of something new in the room. "I am sorry," she said, reaching for the water pitcher. "I did not think you would be here. I live here," he said, without any particular inflection. "Yes," she agreed. "That is precisely the situation." A pause. "You have been teaching 2 weeks," he said, and he still had not looked up. She was surprised. "I have. The Kellerman boy, Thomas, he has been coming home in a better mood." She set the water pitcher down. "You notice that?" His father mentioned it. A pause. "His father works for me occasionally as a deputy. Thomas is very bright," she said carefully. He was frustrated because no one had explained fractions to him in a way that made visual sense. Once I showed him with a piece of rope, he understood immediately. Eli Cutter set his paper down and looked at her for the first time in that conversation, directly and with the full weight of those gray eyes. "You used a rope. I cut it into sections, halves, quarters, eighths. He could hold them and compare them. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of the intention of a smile, the absolute minimum aperture before such a thing would become technically detectable. "That is practical," he said. "I am a practical person," she said. He picked up his paper again. "Good night, Miss Johansson." She took her water and went upstairs and lay awake for a while in the dark, listening to the wind, thinking about a man who noticed what happened to other people's children and called a rope used to teach fractions practical in a tone that made it sound like high praise. The second real conversation happened because of a crisis. It was a Thursday morning in late November, and Lena had come down to find a note slipped under the kitchen door. Not the front door, the kitchen door that faced the backyard, which was unusual enough that she opened it before she was properly awake. The note was from one of her students, a 12-year-old girl named Rose Alcott, and it was 3 lines long and said only, "Miss Johansson, my father is saying I cannot come to school anymore because he needs me at home. Please do not tell the Marshal. Rose." The "please do not tell the Marshal" was what told her everything she needed to know about both the severity of the situation and the nature of Canyon Creek's social landscape. She went to the Alcott farm that afternoon on her own, walking 2 miles in November mud because she did not have a horse, and she found a man named Gerald Alcott, who was not violent, but who was absolutely certain that a 12-year-old girl's education was less important than her ability to help manage a household that had lost its mother the previous spring. He was not unreasonable. He was simply wrong, and he was wrong in the specific way of a man who had never had to defend his assumptions against anyone who disagreed with them. Lena disagreed with them for 45 minutes, standing in his front yard in the mud, until he agreed to let Rose continue attending school in the mornings on the condition that she was home by noon. She walked back to town in the dark, arrived at the Marshal's house at 6:30 in the evening, and walked through the front door into a house that had lamplight in the front room and the smell of something actually cooking in the kitchen, which surprised her so much she stopped in the entryway. Eli Cutter appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. He looked at her boots, which were caked with mud. He looked at her dress, which was not doing much better. He looked at her face, which was cold and tired in that particular combination that people get when they have been doing something emotionally difficult in bad weather. "You walked to the Alcott farm," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, "in this weather." "The weather was not ideal," she conceded. "Rose Alcott wrote you a note." She looked at him. "You knew about the note." "I know about most things that happen in this town," he said, with a flatness that was not arrogant but simply factual. "I was going to speak to Alcott myself in the morning. I spoke to him this afternoon. And he is going to let her continue mornings only." The expression on his face was something she had not seen there before. It was not quite approval, but it was in that territory. He agreed to that. "Eventually," she said, and then realized she had said the Swedish arrangement of it, eventually, and corrected herself. "Eventually, it took a while." "I expect it did." He paused. "There is soup on the stove. I made enough for 2 because I did not think about not doing that." She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking at a point somewhere to the left of her face, which she was beginning to understand was how he looked at people when he was saying something that cost him something. "Thank you," she said. They ate soup at the kitchen table without saying very much, but it was the first time they had sat in the same room voluntarily for more than 2 minutes, and when she finished her bowl, she felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the soup. The weeks passed. November moved into December, and December brought snow, and the snow brought a particular kind of quiet to Canyon Creek that Lena found unexpectedly beautiful. The mountains were enormous in the winter, white and absolute, and the sky above them was the deepest blue she had ever seen, a blue that made the Swedish sky she had grown up under look like a draft of the original. She and the Marshal developed a kind of careful coexistence that was not friendship and was not indifference. It was something in between, a mutual recognition, a noticing. She learned his rhythms. He was up before dawn always. He came home in the evenings at varied hours, depending on what the day had held. He did not drink. He read those 5 books in rotation, she finally observed, coming back to them the way some people came back to certain prayers, not for new information but for the comfort of known ground. She learned about Clara from Harold Stokes, because it was the kind of story that a town carried in its collective memory, and eventually offered to newcomers as a form of orientation. Clara Cutter had been his wife. She had died in the winter of 1875, 4 years past now, of complications following a miscarriage. She had been 28. They had been married for 2 years. He had, by every account Harold Stokes had, been a different man before. Not soft exactly, Harold was careful to say, but present in a way that he was not any more. Like a lamp that was still burning but had been turned low. Lena did not tell Harold Stokes what the information did to her. She thanked him and bought a length of ribbon for Rose Alcott's hair, and walked home through the December snow thinking about all the ways that grief could become architecture. She understood it. She had her own version, smaller scaled but recognizable. The thing with Aldous Brennan had not been love, not remotely, but it had been a kind of faith in people's basic decency that she had lost, and the loss of it had made her careful in ways she had not been before. She recognized carefulness. She recognized the specific loneliness of someone who had been careful for so long that they could not always remember where the wall was anymore. December brought something else, too. It brought the Tanner Gang. The Tanner Gang was not a romantic name for a collection of outlaws. It was the name of 4 men. 3 brothers named Tanner, and a 4th man named Cole Whitmore, who had married a Tanner sister, and was therefore included in the family designation, who operated in the Wet Mountains corridor and had been a persistent problem for the region since 1876. They robbed stages. They robbed mines. They had twice hit the bank in Pueblo and once hit a smaller bank in a town called Silver Cross, 20 miles south of Canyon Creek. They were not murderers by preference, but they were not opposed to it when pressed. Marshal Eli Cutter had been after them for 2 years. Lena learned this gradually, in pieces, from Harold Stokes, from Thomas Kellerman's father, Deputy Reuben Kellerman, from overheard conversations at the general store. The Tanner Gang was the quiet obsession at the center of Eli Cutter's professional life. The thing he had built his recent years around. The thing that gave shape to his solitary, disciplined existence. He had a map on the wall of his office, Harold Stokes told her, with the locations of every Tanner incident marked on it, and he studied it the way a general studies terrain. She had seen the map when she had occasion to go by the office once, through the window. She had seen the marshal standing in front of it with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted slightly, reading it. He had looked in that moment like a man who was solving a very important problem and was reasonably confident he was close. The proximity of the Tanner Gang to Canyon Creek became real and not abstract on a Wednesday afternoon in the 2nd week of December, when a ranch hand named Pete Orvis rode into town at speed and reported that he had seen 4 men matching the Tanner description, moving through the lower pass south of town. The school let out early. Eli Cutter organized his 2 deputies and a civilian posse of 4 men and rode south. He was gone for 3 days. In those 3 days, Lena ran the school, managed her students, helped Delphine Marsh with what turned out to be a minor chimney fire at the boarding house, and tried not to think about the fact that she checked the north end of Main Street every morning and evening for a particular horse and rider. She failed at not thinking about it. He came back on a Saturday, the 14th of December, and they had not caught the Tanner Gang, but they had run them far enough south into Huerfano County that it would be someone else's immediate problem, and one of the 4 horses had been identified as a stolen animal and recovered. This was not the victory it needed to be. Eli Cutter came home on Saturday afternoon, and she was in the kitchen, breaking her own rule, because she had been in there making soup for herself, and she had made enough for two without thinking about it, which was how she found out what it felt like to do the same thing he had done. He walked in and stopped. He looked at the soup on the stove. He looked at her. "I made enough for two," she said carefully, "because I did not think about not doing that." She heard him exhale through his nose. Something in his posture settled, very slightly, like a weight that had been held at arm's length for a long time being allowed to come a fraction of an inch closer to the body. "Thank you," he said. They ate soup again in the kitchen, but this time they talked, properly talked, for the first time about things that were not Rose Alcott's education or town business. She asked him about the mountains, because she was genuinely curious about the geography of the place she now lived. He knew them with the particular intimacy of a man who had spent years riding through them, and he talked about them differently than he talked about most things, with slightly more life in his voice, slightly less careful distance. She told him about Sweden, about the mountains there, about the way the light worked in summer when it barely got dark. He asked her questions about it, real questions, the kind that meant he was actually interested. When they finished eating, he stood to take the bowls to the wash basin and said, without looking at her, "You are good at this." "At what?" "Talking to people." A pause. "Getting them talking." She looked at his back. "You are not difficult to talk to," she said, "when you decide not to be." A pause. "Is that what I am doing?" "Yes," she said simply. He turned from the wash basin and looked at her, and for just a moment, those gunmetal eyes were not flat and unreflective but something else. Something that was reading her the way he read his map, carefully and with the full force of his attention. Then he nodded once, as if he had confirmed something, and said good night, and went upstairs. Lena sat at the kitchen table for a long time after, in the lamplight, with her hands around an empty coffee cup, thinking about the particular danger of learning to see someone clearly. Christmas came and went. She spent Christmas Day with the Stokes family, who had 3 children and a warm and chaotic house, and fed her until she had to unbutton the top 2 buttons of her dress in the privacy of the pantry. Eli Cutter spent Christmas Day at his office, which she knew because she walked past it in the afternoon and saw the lamp burning. She did not stop. She thought about stopping. She did not. But she came home that evening and left a piece of Mrs. Stokes's Christmas cake on the kitchen table with a note that said only, "In case you did not eat today." And in the morning the plate was empty and the note was gone. The new year came in cold and bright, 1880, and in the second week of January something shifted. She had been sick. Nothing dramatic. A cold that had settled in her chest and made her voice go rough, the kind of thing that was annoying rather than alarming, but that required her to spend 2 days in bed drinking hot water with honey, because that was what her mother had always done. She had sent a note to the school explaining her absence. She had taken care of herself with the self-sufficiency of a woman who had been doing that for years, and on the second day she had heard a knock on her bedroom door. She called out that she was fine, which was mostly true. The door opened. Eli Cutter stood in the doorway, not coming in, just standing there with a cup in his hand, and the expression of a man who was doing something that made him uncomfortable and had decided to do it anyway. "Harold Stokes's wife sent this," he said, holding out the cup. "She heard you were unwell." Lena pushed herself upright in bed, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. "She is very kind." He walked into the room the first time she realized that he had ever come into this room and set the cup on the small table beside the bed. Steam came off it. It smelled like ginger and honey. "You have been teaching with a cold for a week," he said. "The children needed the lessons. You should have taken the days sooner." "I know," she said. She sounded rougher than she would have liked. Thank you for bringing this." He did not leave immediately. He stood beside the table, and she could see him deciding whether to say something and then deciding to say it. "I would have if you needed anything. You could have said, 'Marshal Cutter,'" she said gently. "Eli," he said, and then looked as if he had not entirely intended to say that. She looked at him. He was looking at the window. The winter light was coming through the calico curtain she had made in October, and it made the room look different than it usually did, softer, warmer. The room that had been empty for 4 years. "Eli," she repeated, trying the name. "Thank you." He nodded and left, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs, and she drank the ginger tea and thought, "I am in serious trouble." She was in serious trouble. The nature of the trouble was this. She had not come to Canyon Creek to fall in love. She had come to Canyon Creek to start over, to build something stable and her own, to put sufficient distance between herself and Minneapolis and Aldous Brennan's false accusations that she could construct a life that was not defined by someone else's dishonesty. She had intended to be sensible, to focus on her students, to be a practical woman in a practical situation. She had not intended to notice the way Eli Cutter's voice changed, very slightly, when he was talking about something he actually cared about, or the way he fixed things around the house. Quietly, without announcement, the loose step on the stairs that had been bothering her, and then suddenly was not bothering her anymore. The window latch in the kitchen that she had struggled with, and that worked perfectly one morning without explanation. She had not intended to care that he was lonely in a way that he would never name or admit, that he carried Clara's death like a stone in his chest, that the 5 books on his shelf were probably the 5 books Clara had loved. She had not intended any of it. She was doing it anyway. She went back to school on Thursday. On Friday afternoon, she came home to find Eli in the front yard splitting wood, which was a task he did with the focused economy of motion that characterized everything he did. And she stopped and watched him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before going inside. He came in an hour later and found her reading by the window. "How is your voice?" he said. "Better," she said. "Good." He went toward the kitchen, then stopped. "There are 6 books on the shelf now." She looked up. "There are." A pause. "You put one of yours there." She had done this deliberately, 3 days ago, without quite deciding to. A small claiming of shared space. A small vote of confidence in the continued existence of this strange arrangement. She had put there a copy of a novel by George Eliot, Middlemark, which she had read so many times the spine was held together with 2 careful wraps of cotton thread. "I thought it looked lonely with only 5, she said carefully. He looked at the shelf. He looked at the book. He looked at her, briefly, with that full attention reading the map look. Then he went into the kitchen and she heard him start the coffee. She breathed out slowly. The Tanner gang came back to Canyon Creek in February. Not dramatically, not with guns drawn, which would have been easier in a way. They came back with a plan. It was revealed to Eli Cutter on a Thursday morning, when Deputy Kellerman came into the office with information from a contacted informant. The Tanner gang had been observed meeting twice in the past 2 weeks with a man in Pueblo who was employed at the Canyon Creek Land Office. The land office held the deed records for the entire region, including the mining claims that had been slowly, quietly accumulating value as the Denver and Rio Grande Railway's potential southward route became more widely discussed. Someone in the land office was selling them information. Someone who could tell them exactly which claims were being staked and by whom, and therefore which mines would be worth hitting once the railway deal was finalized. The informant did not know who in the land office it was. But it was, Deputy Kellerman reported with visible reluctance, one of 3 people, and one of those 3 people was a man named Samuel Alcott, who was the land office clerk, who was Rose Alcott's father. Eli Cutter told Lena this on a Friday evening, which she found out later was because he did not tell her personal things, except apparently when they pertained to someone she cared about. He told her flatly and clearly, giving her the information without commentary, and then said, "I am telling you because if I investigate Alcott and he is involved, there will be complications for Rose." Lena sat very still. "How certain are you?" "Not certain." "That is why I investigate rather than arrest. If he is involved, then he faces the law," Eli said, and his voice was entirely without heat, which somehow made it more serious. "That is how it works. I am sorry about Rose." Lena looked at the table. "What happens to Rose if her father goes to prison?" A long silence. "She would need a family to take her in. She would not be put on the street. She would need to keep going to school," Lena said. He looked at her. "Yes." "Then we will make sure that happens," Lena said, "regardless of what you find." She heard him exhale. That small sound she had come to understand was not quite a sigh, was more like the sound a valve makes when pressure is released in a controlled way. "You are very certain of things," he said. "I am certain of the things that matter," she said. "Rose matters." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes, she does." The investigation took 11 days and turned out not to implicate Samuel Alcott, which was a relief so significant that Lena felt it physically. A loosening in her shoulders that she had been carrying since that Friday evening. The man who was the informant was the other clerk, a man named Perry Watts, who had been in financial trouble since a bad harvest had devastated his side business in 1879, and who had thought, wrongly, that selling information to the Tanner gang was a problem he could manage and then stop. Perry Watts was arrested on a Tuesday morning in mid-February. The Tanner brothers and Cole Whitmore, now with both their network of information and their freedom of movement compromised, shifted their operations north toward the Arkansas River Valley. And within 3 weeks, there was a telegraph report that U.S. Marshals out of Denver had picked up 2 of the brothers, and a federal warrant had been issued for the other 2. Eli Cutter came home on the Tuesday of Perry Watts's arrest looking like a man who had put down something heavy. Not happy exactly. She did not think happy was a register he operated in naturally, but settled, as if several things had clicked into alignment. He told her what had happened. She listened. She said she was glad. He said, "Thank you for not," and then stopped. "For not what?" she asked, a pause. "For not asking about the investigation while it was happening, for trusting that I knew what I was doing." She looked at him carefully. "Did you need me to trust that?" He thought about this. "I did not know I needed it," he said, which was one of the most honest things she had heard him say. March came in like a lion, which the people of Canyon Creek prepared for, and the mountain seemed to enjoy. Lena had been in the Marshal's house for 5 months. She had a school that was thriving. She had Rose Alcott reading 2 levels above her age. She had Thomas Kellerman understanding long division. She had a community that had, over 5 months, shifted from polite wariness to genuine warmth, because Lena Johansson was the kind of person that places opened up to. She listened well. She helped without being asked, and she did not treat a small Colorado town as a lesser version of somewhere more important. She had also, irrevocably and probably disastrously, fallen in love with the Marshal. She knew it clearly by now. She had stopped arguing with herself about it approximately 6 weeks into the process, because she was a practical woman and wasting energy on argument with confirmed facts was not practical. The fact was that Eli Cutter was the most interesting person she had met in her adult life, not because he was easy or warm or demonstrative, but because the things that were there, underneath all that careful architecture, were real in a way that she found she needed in a person. He was honest. He was genuinely, unsentimentally good. Not always nice, but good, which was the more important quality. He was quietly attentive in ways he would never have admitted to. And he was, under all of it, still cracked open from loss, still raw in a place he did not show anyone. She was deeply, thoroughly in love with him, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it, because a woman in 1880 did not march up to a man who had offered her lodging on a practical basis and inform him of her feelings with the expectation that this would be well received. And because even if she had been inclined to do so, she was not sure that he had any feelings to receive. Except, there were small things, very small, the kind of things that could mean something or could mean nothing, depending on what you brought to the reading of them. The wood was always split and stacked before she needed to fill the firebox. The coffee was always ready in the mornings, even the mornings she came down earlier than usual. He had repaired the window frame of her classroom without being asked, simply appearing at the school on a Saturday with his tools and doing it. He had taken to asking in the evenings what she was reading, not with particular intensity but regularly, which was its own kind of regularity. He asked about her students by name, remembered details she had mentioned once in passing, brought up those details later in a way that meant he had been thinking about them. He looked at her. Not always, not in any way that could be called obvious, but she caught it, the moment when she was saying something and turned back to find his eyes already on her, and the moment when he looked away. She did not know what any of it meant. She could not read this particular map. And then came the morning of March 18th, 1880. The night before, she had lain awake too long and risen too early, at 5 in the morning, with the particular restless energy of someone who has been turning something over in their mind for too long. She had come downstairs with the intention of making coffee. She had found the kitchen cold and clean and the pantry reasonably stocked. She had bought flour and butter and lard at Stokes's store 2 days ago, along with baking powder and salt and a small tin of dried cream. She had stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the silence of the house, feeling the cold air, and then she had made a decision. She was going to make biscuits. She had not made them since Minnesota, since the small kitchen of the boarding house she had lived in there, where she had made them on Sunday mornings, because they were her mother's recipe, and her mother's kitchen had smelled like this, like flour and butter and the particular promise of a hot oven. She had not let herself make them in Canyon Creek, because she had told herself she was a boarder and the kitchen was not hers. But she was tired of telling herself things that kept her at arm's length from her own life. She worked quietly in the early dark, with only the lamp on the kitchen table for light. She made the fire in the stove and waited for the oven to come up to heat. She measured the flour into the bowl, cut the cold lard in with her fingers, added the salt and baking powder. She made the well in the center and added the buttermilk she had on the shelf, mixed it with the particular light touch that biscuits require, not too much, just enough, and turned it onto the floured board and cut the rounds. She hummed while she worked. A Swedish song her mother had sung, something about summer and returning. She did not think about the Marshal. She thought about her mother and her mother's kitchen, and the way morning light looked on that old pine table. And she thought about Rose Alcott reading above her level, and Thomas Kellerman holding a rope and counting fractions. And she thought about how this cold, beautiful, enormous country had somehow, despite everything, started to feel like somewhere she could be. The biscuits went into the skillet and into the oven. She hummed. And then she heard a sound at the door and looked up, and Eli Cutter was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand. She had come in from her morning ride. Or rather, she had not. He had come in from his morning circuit of the town, the one he did every morning before full daylight, checking that everything was as it should be, and he had come in through the back door as he sometimes did, and he had stopped. She saw his face. She saw, on the face of a man who did not allow himself to be read, every single thing he was feeling, all at once, with no defenses because he had not had time to build them. She saw grief, and she saw recognition, and she saw something else that was not grief at all, something that was new and uncertain and enormous. She saw a man who had come home to a kitchen that smelled like something he thought he would never have again, and who could not move. "There is coffee on the shelf," she said, to give him something to do with it. "I found the pot." He did not answer. She turned and looked at him, and she saw everything again, his face still open, unguarded, the hat in his hands. She said gently, "You look like you have seen a ghost, Marshal." "You should not be in this kitchen," he said, and it came out raw without its usual flatness, and she understood immediately that he was not telling her she had broken a rule. "I know," she said, and she set down the spoon. She looked at him steadily. "I know I should not be. But I am here now, and the biscuits are nearly done, and I think you have not eaten a proper meal in longer than you would admit." He did not move. The oven ticked. The smell of browning biscuits filled the room. "She made biscuits," he said, and it was barely above a whisper, and he was not talking to Lena, not really. He was talking to something else, to the year 1875, or to a dark-haired woman in a photograph. "She made them every Sunday morning." "I know," Lena said, although she had not known about the biscuits specifically. She knew enough. "I thought—" He stopped. "I know," she said again, and she said it very gently, and she did not move toward him because some distances are for the person in pain to cross. He stood there for a long time. The oven ticked. The lamp burned. The mountains outside the window were turning from black to blue as the sun began its approach. Then he said, "Why did you?" "Because I wanted to," she said. "Because this is my kitchen too for now. Because I was thinking about my mother's Sunday mornings, and I did not want to keep myself at arm's length from my own life." A pause. "And because I wanted you to have a real breakfast." She watched him put his hat on the peg beside the door. She watched him sit down at the kitchen table, heavily, like a man whose legs had just remembered they were carrying the weight of 4 years. She took the biscuits out of the oven. She put them on the table, in the cloth she had warmed on the stove, and she poured his coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across from him. He looked at the biscuits. He picked one up. He split it in half the way you only know to do if someone has shown you, pulling rather than cutting, and steam rose from the center. He ate it without butter, and she watched his face, and she watched the thing that happened there. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not a sudden revolution, or a transformation, or an event that could be described in clear terms. It was quieter than that. It was a man eating a warm biscuit on a cold March morning, and something in his face, in his eyes, that had been held tightly for 4 years, simply and gently and completely releasing. He ate 3 biscuits. He drank 2 cups of coffee. Then he set down the cup and looked at her, and this time when he looked at her he did not look away. "Lena," he said. "Yes," she said. "I need to tell you something, all right." He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment, then looked at her. "I have been—" He stopped. Started again. "This house has been empty for a long time, not empty of people, empty of—" He stopped again. "I know," she said for the 4th time, but differently this time. "I did not think I wanted it to not be empty," he said. "I decided that. I made myself decide that because—" A pause. "Because losing someone costs something you cannot get back, and I decided I was not going to pay that cost again." She said nothing. She waited. "But you put a book on my shelf," he said. And there was something in his voice then, something that was almost helpless, almost baffled, as if no human being had ever done anything as significant as putting a book on a shelf. And you walked 2 miles in November mud for a 12-year-old girl who was not your family. And you made soup when I came home and you said the same thing I said. He stopped. His jaw worked. I made enough for 2, she said softly, because I did not think about not doing that. Yes, he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the March morning light, with the smell of biscuits and coffee around them, and she thought, here it is. The moment you cannot take back. The moment where you either go forward or you don't. She said, I did not come here expecting anything. I want you to know that. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and I stayed because it is good here. The town is good, the children are good, and you, she stopped for a breath. You are good, Eli. Not easy, but good. And I have been trying very hard not to care about you more than a boarding arrangement allows, and I have been failing at it for approximately 4 months. He looked at her. The morning light came fully through the window. He said, I have been failing at not caring about you since you told me you used a rope to teach fractions. She felt something bloom in her chest, warm and enormous. She said, that is a very specific moment. It was a very specific thought, he said. It was, this woman is remarkable. And I told myself to stop thinking that. You are very good at telling yourself things, she said. I am getting worse at it, he said, and it sounded like both a confession and a concession, and possibly the most he had ever said about himself to another person in 4 years. Lena reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand. He did not move. Then he turned his hand over and closed his fingers around hers and held on. They sat like that for a long time. Outside, Canyon Creek was waking up. The livery stable doors opened. Somewhere down the street a dog barked. The sun came over the mountains and fell through the kitchen window and made a bright rectangle on the table between them. He said finally, I should tell you about Clara. You do not have to, she said. I want to, he said. I want you to know. So he told her. He told her in the spare, careful way he told all important things, without decoration, without drama, just the facts in their weight and order. He told her about marrying Clara in the spring of 1873, about coming to Canyon Creek together because there was marshalling work and he was good at it, and she had wanted to try the West. He told her about the year they had been happy here, genuinely happy, building the house and the life and the small future they had imagined together. He told her about the winter of 1875, about the pregnancy that they had been careful not to celebrate too loudly because it still felt fragile, and about how quickly it had gone wrong, and how quickly after that she was gone. He told it without crying, because he was a man of a particular time and place and formation. But she could hear the shape of the grief in his voice, the places where it was still raw under the years of careful management. And she held his hand and listened, and did not fill any silence with anything unnecessary. When he was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she would have liked you. Lena felt tears prick her eyes. She pressed them back. Would she? She believed people should be practical, he said. She did not have patience for people who were only ornamental. She would have thought you were a pause. She would have liked the biscuits and the rope. Lena laughed, which she had not expected to do, and it came out wrong and warm, and she had to put her free hand over her eyes for a moment. I am sorry, she said. Don't be, he said. Don't be sorry for laughing. She looked at him through the blur of something that was not quite crying. He was looking at her with an expression that was new, that she had not seen before. Open and tentative and very real, with none of the careful management, just his actual face. I am terrified, he said quietly. I know, she said. I know you are. I am going to try anyway, he said. If you... Yes, she said before he finished. I already answered yes. He looked at her. Then, slowly, carefully, as if he were doing something he needed to be sure about, he brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, briefly and with enormous gravity, and then set her hand down gently on the table and let go. She put her other hand on top of his, and they sat together in the March morning with the biscuits cooling between them and the sun filling the kitchen. The courtship of Eli Cutter and Lena Johansson was, by the standards of Canyon Creek, conducted with unusual propriety. This was mostly because the Marshal was constitutionally incapable of being improper, and Lena had her own strong sense of what was right and what was reckless, and the intersection of these two qualities produced a very deliberate and careful romance that Harold Stokes observed with the satisfied attention of a man who had known all along how things would go and was pleased to be proven right. They took their first real walk together on a Sunday afternoon in late March, which in Canyon Creek meant that half the town saw them from various windows, and the other half heard about it before supper. Eli walked with his hands in his pockets, and she walked with her hand through his elbow, and they went south along the creek for an hour and talked about things that were not urgent and were entirely important, about what they wanted, about what they had both been afraid of, about the kinds of lives they imagined, and whether those lives could overlap. He said at one point, looking at the creek, "I like this town. I am not going to leave it." "I like this town," she said. "I was not planning to leave it." He looked at her sideways. "That was not exactly a declaration." "It was exactly a declaration," she said. "It was just wrapped very practically." He was quiet for a moment. "I am going to be honest with you about something." "You are always honest with me about things," she said. "I am going to be honest about one more," he said. "I have been thinking about the rest of my life differently for about 3 months, and the difference is you being in it." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She said, "Eli Cutter, that is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." He looked slightly alarmed. "That was romantic." "For you," she said, "that was extremely romantic." He looked down at the creek. The corner of his mouth moved in that way that was not quite a smile. "I need more practice," he said. "You have time," she said. In April, he asked permission to call on her formally, which made Harold Stokes laugh when he heard about it because the man had been living with the woman for 6 months. But it was the right thing to do, and they both knew it, and it established things on their proper footing. He spoke to her the way a man speaks when he has thought about the words very carefully, and she received what he said the way she received important things, with her full attention and without minimizing it. In May, he kissed her for the first time in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning that was not particularly significant, except that she had been making coffee and he had come in and watched her for a moment, and then simply said her name. And when she turned, he was right there, and he kissed her with the same unhurried certainty that he brought to everything that mattered. And it was, without question, the best Tuesday she had ever had. The school year ended in June, and the town celebrated with a social. A gathering in the field behind the church with long tables and a fiddle player from Pueblo and lanterns strung between posts that Harold Stokes had put up the previous afternoon. Every family in the region came, and the tables were covered in food, and the children ran until they were too tired to run and then sat on the grass in small, exhausted heaps. And the adults talked and the fiddle played, and the evening was warm, and the stars came out over the mountains. Eli danced with her once, which was more dancing than anyone in Canyon Creek had seen him do in 4 years. He was not a natural dancer, but he was steady, and he held her hand with care, and when the song ended, he did not let go of her hand for a moment after it was necessary. Delphine Marsh and 3 other women of a certain type made it their business to be seen noticing. Lena smiled at them pleasantly and let them notice. The summer was long and good. The Tanner brothers, the two remaining ones, were caught by federal marshals in July near Raton Pass and charged with multiple counts of robbery. Eli received the telegraph notification on a Thursday morning and came home and told Lena, and then sat in the front room for a while in a way that she understood was the particular quiet of a man whose long work was concluded. She brought him coffee and sat beside him, not talking, which was sometimes the best thing. The case against them was solid. They would not be a threat to this region again. He proposed on a Saturday evening in August, in the kitchen, which was where all the important things happened between them, sitting across the table in the way they had sat that first morning with the biscuits. And he said that he wanted to marry her, and that he understood if she needed time, and that he was not going to change his mind. He said it with his hands flat on the table and his gray eyes on her face and the absolute absence of performance. She said yes immediately, and then she said, "You did not need to say you would not change your mind. I know you do not change your mind." He said, "I wanted you to have all the information." She said, "I want to marry you. That is my answer. That is all of my information." He reached across the table and took her hands, both of them this time, and held them. And something in his face did the thing it had done that March morning. The thing she had come to know as the truest version of him, the one that existed when all the walls were down. They were married in September, in the small church on Main Street that held services every Sunday, with Reverend Mark Hogan performing the ceremony, and Harold, and his wife Margaret Stokes as witnesses, and Rose Alcott and Thomas Kellerman. And most of the school sitting in the pews because Lena had told her students about the wedding, and they had all simply appeared, which Eli had looked at when he saw it and said nothing, but whose expression said that he did not entirely mind. Delphine Marsh cried at the appropriate moment. Reuben Kellerman, the deputy, shook Eli's hand afterward with an emotion that was very clearly relief on behalf of the entire town that the Marshal had finally returned to the human race. They said the words. He said, "I will," in the flat, certain voice he used for things that were permanently decided, and she said it back in a voice that only shook a very little. He kissed her in the church with considerably more feeling than the reverend had perhaps strictly authorized. The town cheered. They lived in the same house, the white faded house at the north end of Main Street, and Lena made the spare room no longer spare by bringing her books down to the main shelves, and her things into the bedroom that they now shared, and the kitchen became fully hers and his together, which was how it had always been in spirit. She kept teaching. The school board had long since moved her off probationary status, and she had 3 more students than she had started with, because 2 families had moved to the area in the summer, and 1 family that had been keeping their daughter home had seen what Rose Alcott's education was doing for Rose and reconsidered. Eli kept marshalling. The work of a small-town frontier marshal in 1880 was less dramatic than the dime novel suggested. Mostly it was disputes over property lines and drunks on Friday nights, and the occasional genuine crisis, which he handled with the quiet, decisive efficiency that was simply his nature. They were happy. It was not the happiness of a novel, not the large operatic happiness of dramatic people in dramatic situations. It was the happiness of 2 people who had each been through something that took a piece of them, and had found, unexpectedly, that the missing pieces happened to match the shape of the other person's presence. In November, 1 year after she had arrived in Canyon Creek, Lena realized she was expecting a child. She told Eli on a Tuesday evening. She had been careful with how she planned to say it. She had thought about it for 3 days, how much he would feel the fear, given how he had lost Clara, how the word pregnancy would carry everything he carried about 1875. She planned to be calm and clear and to give him time. What she did not plan for was his face. She said it simply, "I am expecting a child. In the spring, I think. I wanted you to know, and I wanted you to know that I am healthy and there is no reason." He crossed the room and held her, which he did not do impulsively. It was not his nature, and the fact that he did it without thought told her everything she needed to know about what he was feeling. She felt his arms around her and his face against her hair, and she felt the tension in him, the fear she had expected. But she also felt something else, something enormous and still, and when he pulled back to look at her, his eyes were bright. "Are you?" he started. "I am well," she said. "I am very well." He put his hand against her face. "We are going to be careful," he said. "We are going to do everything right. We are going to do everything we can," she corrected gently. "And then we will trust." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, and the fear did not disappear from his face, but it moved over to make room for something that was stronger. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was the most careful and attentive months of Lena Johansson, Cutter's life. Eli watched over her with the focused dedication of a man whose protective instinct had found its clearest possible object. He was not oppressive about it. She was not a person who would have tolerated oppressive, and he knew her well enough to know that. But he was present and attentive in ways that would have surprised anyone who had known him in the years before. He was up before her every morning to make the fire and the coffee. He checked in on her during the day, not constantly, not intrusively, but enough. He read everything he could find about confinement and delivery, which in Canyon Creek meant 3 medical pamphlets Harold Stokes had ordered from Denver, and he read them with the same focused attention he had given to the Tanner investigation map. Lena continued teaching through February, which raised some eyebrows in the more conventional quarters of Canyon Creek. But she was healthy, and her students needed her, and she was not going to spend 4 months sitting by a window when there were 12-year-olds who needed to understand the American Revolution. She stopped teaching in early March, when her body made it clear that the time for stopping had arrived, and she spent the last weeks of her confinement reading and sewing and writing long letters to her mother in Sweden. Letters that described a life so full and so different from anything her mother had imagined for her when she had left for America that she was not sure the letters fully communicated the truth of it. She tried anyway. She told her mother about the mountains and the cold, clear sky and the children she taught and the man she had married, this man who was so careful and so good and who had come to her doorway on a March morning with a cracked, open heart and the smell of biscuits filling the kitchen. The baby came on a Wednesday in April. It was not easy. Nothing about birth in 1881 in a small Colorado town was easy, and she labored through most of a day and into the evening with the midwife Mrs. Georgiana Foster in attendance, and Margaret Stokes there for the simple, invaluable purpose of being a calm woman who had done this herself 4 times and knew that the fear was survivable. Eli was not in the room, because that was not how things were done, but she knew he was in the house. She could feel his presence in the house like a kept promise, and she held on to that while she did the hardest work she had ever done. The baby was born at 7:30 in the evening, with the April mountains outside the window going pink in the last light. It was a boy. Mrs. Foster placed him in Lena's arms, and he was red and furious and loud. And Lena felt her heart simply expand to dimensions she had not previously known it contained. She held him, and she laughed, and she cried, and she said something in Swedish that was not a sentence, but was everything she felt. They brought Eli in. He came to the side of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and Lena watched his face do the thing. That thing, the full aperture, everything visible but more now, bigger now, an emotion with no ceiling. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her, very carefully, and she put the boy into his arms, and Eli Cutter held his son with the specific careful terror of a man who had never held anything so important and was not going to drop it. "He is very loud," Eli said. "He has opinions," Lena said. "About what?" "About being born," she said. "I think he found it inconvenient." Eli looked down at the small, furious face. Something moved over his own face that was too large to name. That was years of grief and years of walls and a cold, empty house, and a March morning with biscuits, and a woman who put books on lonely shelves. All of it. Moving through and making space for this. They named him William James Cutter. William for the weight of it, James because it had been Eli's father's name, and they called him Will from the first day, because he was emphatically himself from the first day, and anything more formal seemed like an overestimate. Will was, as it turned out, a baby with very strong opinions about most things and the lung capacity to express them, which kept the north end of Main Street informed of his schedule and mood for the better part of his first year. He had his mother's blue-gray eyes and his father's stubbornness, and from a very young age the same focused attention, the same way of looking at a problem from every angle before deciding what to do about it. Life arranged itself around him and kept going. Lena went back to teaching in September when Will was 5 months old, bringing him with her for the first month because he was not yet weaned, and because several of her students had younger siblings and were therefore perfectly comfortable with a baby in the schoolroom, and because in the practical matter of educating the children of Canyon Creek a small pragmatic amount of flexibility had always been necessary. She left him with Margaret Stokes in October when he was eating properly, and the arrangement worked well because Margaret Stokes deeply enjoyed babies and Will deeply enjoyed the Stokes household, which had a great deal of activity and noise, both of which were exactly his preference. Eli became, gradually and without announcing it, a father in the fullest sense, not just present but engaged, the kind of engaged that surprised people who only knew the Marshal in his official capacity. He carried Will on walks. He showed him things, the horses, the mountains, the stars. He talked to him seriously from the time he was old enough to hold his head up, explaining things in the same flat, certain voice he used for everything, as if there was no reason a 6-month-old should not have the natural world explained to him in accurate detail. Will received these explanations with the focused attention of a child who suspected that information was useful. The years moved, not fast but steadily, with the particular momentum of a good life. Rose Alcott finished her schooling with Lena at 15 and went on to teacher training in Pueblo, which she achieved partly through Lena's relentless encouragement, and a scholarship that the Colorado Territorial School Board had established in 1882. She came back to visit at Christmas and brought her husband, a thoughtful young man named David Chen, who had come to Colorado from California and was working as a surveyor for the railway. And Eli sat across from him at the Christmas table and asked him questions about the railway route with genuine interest, while Rose watched her old teacher and smiled. Thomas Kellerman grew up and became, inevitably, a deputy. He was good at it. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's common sense, and Lena's lesson about ropes and fractions had apparently instilled in him a general confidence in practical approaches to complex problems. Harold Stokes's general store expanded twice and became the social and commercial center of Canyon Creek in a way that Harold had always anticipated, and Margaret had always accepted with patient amusement. In 1884, when Will was 3 years old and had been walking for a year and running for what felt like longer, Lena told Eli she was expecting again. This time, she told him at the kitchen table, over biscuits on a Sunday morning, because she had come to understand that the kitchen was where they said important things. He received the news this time without the fear, or rather with less of it, with the fear in its proper proportion, understood and accepted and smaller than the joy. He reached across the table and took her hands, both of them, the same as always. "A brother for Will," he said. "Or a sister," she said. "Or a sister," he agreed. It was a sister. She was born in November of 1884, in the same room as Will, with the same midwife and the same mountains outside the window. And she was absolutely nothing like Will in the sense that she emerged already quiet and considered, with enormous gray eyes that looked at the world with immediate careful assessment. They named her Clara, and there was a moment when Lena said the name and looked at Eli's face, and the grief moved through him, the old grief. And she held his hand and let it pass, and what remained after it was peace. Clara Cutter grew up with her brother's stubbornness and her father's particular quality of stillness, and she had her grandmother's Swedish coloring, pale hair, those impossible blue-gray eyes, and she and Will together were so different from each other and so completely inseparable that anyone watching them play in the yard of the White House on Main Street would have felt the specific happiness of seeing two small people who were exactly where they were supposed to be. The house was no longer faded. Eli had repainted it in the spring of 1882, white again but properly this time, and Lena had planted flowers along the fence. Swedish wildflowers grown from seeds her mother had sent in a packet through the postal service, which had arrived after an extraordinary journey and had mostly survived. They bloomed every summer in colors that had no business looking as right as they did against the Colorado backdrop. The Marshal's office still had the map on the wall, but the Tanner incidents were old history now, and the map had acquired other marks. The routes of the new railway, the locations of the new mining claims, the shape of a region that was changing and growing and becoming something different from what it had been when Eli Cutter had first ridden in to take the job. He watched it change with the same careful attention he watched everything, and he was good at his work in the way that people who find their true purpose are good at it. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but in a way that was sustainable and real. In 1886, the Denver and Rio Grande Railway came through 20 miles east of Canyon Creek, which meant the town did not become a railway hub, but also did not become a ghost town, which were the two possible outcomes that had occupied local discussion for the better part of 3 years. It grew at a moderate pace, the pace of a place that is building something rather than being built by something else. By 1888, the population was over 1,200. There were 2 churches, a proper hotel, a telegraph office that was busier every year, and the school had enough students that the board had hired a second teacher to assist Lena. She was 35 in 1888. She was, by every measure of a practical woman's self-assessment, doing well. The school was good. The children were good. Will was 7 and Clara was 3, and the house on Main Street was full and warm and everything it had not been in the years before the Biscuits. On an evening in October of 1888, the children in bed and the house quiet, she sat in the front room with a book, a new one, just arrived from the Denver bookseller she had started ordering from in 1883, which meant the shelf that had held 5 lonely books now held considerably more. And Eli came in from the office and sat in the chair across from her and looked at her in the way he still looked at her, the full attention way, and she put the book down. "What is it?" she asked. He thought for a moment, choosing the words with his usual care. "I was thinking about the morning you made biscuits," he said. She felt warmth move through her. "That was 8 years ago, I know." He looked at the fire. "I was thinking about what would have happened if I had walked back out the door instead of staying." She looked at him. "You thought about walking back out? For about 2 seconds, he said. I took 2 steps back. She thought about it, that morning, the flower on the table, him in the doorway. I did not see you take 2 steps back. You were humming, he said. You did not hear me come in. She sat with this for a moment, with the particular tenderness of learning something new about a morning that she had thought she knew completely. What stopped you? He looked at her across the firelit room, and his face had the expression she loved most, the open, certain one, the one that had no performance in it. You were making the place feel like home, he said. And I had been so cold for so long that I could not walk away from it, even if I was terrified. You walked toward it, she said. I walked toward you, he said. Upstairs, Will turned over in his bed audibly, which was how Will slept. Clara made no sound, which was how Clara slept. The fire crackled. Outside, the mountains were their permanent, enormous selves against the October night sky, and the town made its evening sounds. Lena set her book aside and crossed the room and sat on the arm of his chair, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. And they stayed like that for a long time without speaking, which was the particular luxury of people who had learned to be comfortable in each other's silences. She said eventually, I was not thinking about you when I made them. He made a sound that was an actual laugh, brief and real. I know. I was thinking about my mother. I know that too. A pause. I am glad you came downstairs. I am glad you came in the kitchen door, she said. He pressed his lips to her hair. She felt him smile against it, the full smile, the one that had been so long in coming and was so entirely his. The years continued. They continued in the way of good lives, not without difficulty, not without fear or grief or the ordinary hard work of being alive in a hard country, but with the fundamental certainty of two people who had chosen each other clearly and kept choosing, morning after morning, biscuit after biscuit, book after book on a shelf that no longer held any lonely space. Will Cutter grew up to be a practical, thoughtful, somewhat serious young man who had his father's eyes and his mother's warmth, and who at the age of 18 rode south to study law in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with a recommendation letter from his father and a copy of Middlemark from his mother's shelf, the one with the spine held together with cotton thread. The house at the north end of Main Street was eventually repainted a third time, in 1895, when Ali and Lena and Thomas Kellerman, who was by then a grown man with a deputy star and enough sense to listen to what needed doing, spent a Saturday morning with brushes and a good deal of white paint making it look like a house that was properly tended and properly loved. Which it was, which it had been, Lena thought, since the morning in March of 1880 when she had woken too early with a restless heart and come downstairs to an empty kitchen and made a decision she had not known she was making. Not a decision about a man, not yet. Just a decision to stop keeping herself at arm's length from her own life, to let herself make the things that made her feel at home, to let the smell of biscuits in a cold kitchen be a vote in favor of belonging. Everything else had followed from that. Everything important always had a small beginning. She had told her students over and over in the years of teaching them. The rope held in 2 pieces showing a fraction. The single book placed on a shelf that held 4 others. The flower on the table. The song under the breath. The lamp in the kitchen at 6 in the morning. The man in the doorway with his hat in his hands. The moment before the walls came down. On the morning of their 20th anniversary, which fell on a September Thursday in 1900, she came downstairs before he did, which was unusual. He was almost always up first, and she made biscuits in the kitchen in the early gray light, with the lamp on the table and the stove building heat. She used her mother's recipe, which she had long since memorized, which she could make with her hands on a dark morning without looking, whose smell filled the kitchen and the house with everything it had always meant. She was humming when he came in. She heard him stop. She did not turn around. She heard him, after a moment, sit down at the kitchen table. 20 years, he said. 20 years, she agreed, still facing the stove. And you are still making biscuits in my kitchen. She turned then, and she looked at him. Eli Cutter, 54 years old, the gray at his temples gone all the way through now, the lines of his face more deeply set. The gunmetal eyes no longer flat or unreflective, but warm with everything they had accumulated over 2 decades of a shared life. He was looking at her with the expression that was hers, the one she had first seen on a March morning and had never stopped being grateful for. "It is my kitchen too," she said. "It has been since the first morning," he said. She brought the biscuits to the table and poured the coffee and sat down across from him. And he reached across the table and took her hands, both of them, and held on, outside. The September light was coming over the mountains. The flowers along the fence were still blooming, late in the season, the Swedish ones that had no business being beautiful in Colorado and were beautiful anyway. The town was waking up around them, the sound of Canyon Creek in the morning, the sound of a place that was alive and continuing. "I was thinking," he said, his thumb moving across her knuckles, "about what you said, that first morning, that you were here now and the biscuits were nearly done and you thought I had not eaten properly in longer than I would admit." "You had not," she said. "No," he said. "I had not." A pause. "I had not been a lot of things for a long time." She looked at him. "And now?" He looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light, and he said, with the absolute certainty and the complete absence of performance that was his truest voice, the one she had learned to hear under everything else, "Now I am everything I am supposed to be." She felt it in her whole body, the rightness of that, the completed shape of it. She squeezed his hands and said, "So am I." They had biscuits for breakfast on their anniversary, as they did most mornings, in the kitchen that was fully theirs, in the house that was no longer empty, in the life that had begun not with a grand gesture or a dramatic moment, but with flour on a table, and a cold man standing in a doorway and a woman who had decided, on an ordinary March morning, that she was done keeping herself at arm's length from the place she already knew was home.